Good morning. I am Peggy van der Plas, and today we're going to talk about Canada, and more precisely, how the Trump administration actually might be helpful for Canada. First, by looking at how we could do better business and trade within the country. So maybe in Canada we have 10 provinces, we have 3 territories, one country, but it is actually not that easy to do business among the country. The different provinces can be actually tricky to do business with each other. And that actually might become one of the unexpected consequences of the Trump administration trade policy, is that it might finally force Canadian policymakers to take a hard look at the country's own internal trade barriers. And again, we tend to really put a lot of attention on external trade relationship, but actually the internal trade barriers in Canada are a major, major drag on economic growth. And it really costs actually businesses billions in inefficiencies and lost opportunities. So maybe it is worth having a look. So just to give you some numbers, so studies estimate that the trade restrictions between provinces, again, one country, we're within Canada, the trade restriction between provinces increase the cost of goods by an average of 30%, 30%, with some regions, particularly in the north of the country, seeing trade costs exceeding 60%, 60, and thus due to regulatory fragmentation, infrastructure deficits, and geographic obstacles. So as you can imagine, eliminating these barriers could actually bring a lot of value to Canada. So some studies estimate that removing these trade barriers, these internal trade barriers, could boost GDP per capita by 4%. 4%, and obviously improve business competitiveness within the country, but also outside the country. So, despite these numbers, internal trade remains largely overlooked in the country's broader economic strategy. And now that we are facing, trade dynamics, shifting in the trade dynamics and protectionism, actually, with our largest trading partner, the US, well, we have no choice but to really look at that. So actually might be a blessing in disguise. So again, there is an urgency, and it's not just urgent, it's very important for us to strengthen that internal trade, because Canada's reliance on the United States for trade is really staggering. So 3.6 billion worth of goods, 3.6 billion worth of goods and services cross the border daily. Every day, almost 4 billion worth of goods and services cross the border. More than 63%, so let's say two-thirds of Canada's total trade is with the US. And the US is both Canada's largest investors and top export destination. So again, when you look at these numbers, you understand how deep the integration between Canada and the US actually benefit both economies, not just Canada, but actually the US. But that's a different question. So Canada's economic resilience really is at risk with, again, these new trade policies coming from the US that are increasingly protectionist. So again, policies coming from, Buy American, the tariff, subsidized from the Inflation Reduction Act, shifting energy security strategies. All of that is putting pressure on Canada, and it really, really shows that we being Canada, must reduce internal inefficiencies as much as we can in order to create a stronger domestic trade network so we can mitigate better external shocks like the one we're seeing right now. So I would say that interprovincial trade reform, it is not just an economic opportunity. It is also a national security and a resilience strategy. And as we see the global trade alliance shifting so fast in the last few weeks, again, we really understand why it is so important for Canada to improve this internal trade. So how do we fix interprovincial trade in Canada? So here are some ideas and opportunities to work on. So the first is really about streamlining provincial regulations. So one of the biggest barriers to internal trade is regulatory misalignment. So businesses must comply with different rules for the same goods and services in different provinces. As you can imagine, this adds cost, this adds delays, this adds administrative burden. And let's be honest, there is no good reason for this misalignment, despite, I mean, not sure it is despite. The only good reason would be provincial protectionism. So you're putting in place this fake regulation in order to give a protected market within our provinces. So that's not great. So the solution, obviously, is to implement mutual recognition agreements, which would allow provinces to accept each other's certifications and regulatory standards instead of duplicating them. And I mean, if Europe has been able to do a lot of that, I don't see why we cannot do that in Canada. But I mean, you obviously need the will to do so. The second way to fix the internal trade situation in Canada is to invest in critical infrastructure. The challenge, obviously, Canada is a very large country, not a huge population, but a very big footprint. And the trade costs are disproportionately high in remote regions because you lack roads, rails, digital connectivity, and all of that really drives up transportation and logistic costs. So in Nunavut, for example, trade cost exceeds 60% of the value of goods. So that, as you can imagine, is staggering. So here, one of the solutions is to build a northern transportation corridor to really connect these provinces that are rich in resources, but that are, as I said, isolated to national and international markets. So that would ensure most cost-efficient supply chains and economic inclusion. So really, this northern transportation corridor would be a great opportunity. Always challenging because you're going through different territories. Not everyone is keen on that, but that would definitely help these provinces to be more connected and to reduce the trade costs. The third solutions and options to reduce these internal trade barriers in Canada is to strengthen provincial trade agreements. So we have a trade agreement in Canada, which is called the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, CFTA, which has, let's be honest, reduced some barriers, but it lacks strong enforcement mechanisms. So some provinces still continue to impose protectionism policy, particularly in sectors like energy, construction, and alcohol distribution. So here, the solution is really to expand sector-specific trade liberalization. And again, focusing on this industry that are highly interconnected across provincial borders, such as manufacturing, clean energy, professional services. So a lot of that actually is in our hands as Canadian or government of Canada, like again, we're looking at the US, we're not happy, but a lot of what is not working and where we're shooting ourselves in the foot is coming within Canada. So I think we also need to put our big boy and big girl pants here. We can do a lot for our own country here. So another option actually to improve the trade within Canada is to increase federal provincial coordination. And Canadian provinces often act very independently and they prioritize local industries over national economic efficiency. So I witnessed that many times. I was a founding board member at Invest in Canada, which is the organization that is helping bring FDI in Canada, foreign direct investment. So we have the federal level, we have a provincial level. So almost all provinces have their own agency that is responsible for bringing FDI in their province. And then you have cities that have also agencies to bring foreign direct investments in their cities. As you can imagine, there is actually competition happening between the cities, sometimes of the same province, between the provinces, between the cities. So it makes it for not very coherent approach. And that is just one of the example. I would say the creation of Invest in Canada was great because the goal was to really help for these very large projects to channel towards the right province, because sometimes, a province or a city is way better positioned to win. They have the right resources. They're just, for example, close to water, close to the minerals. Maybe they're close to a tech hub. So they're very, positioned to succeed. But unfortunately, because 5 different provinces and cities put forward a proposal, while on the other side of the table, the company is confused and might decide to go in a country that has only one offer that seems extremely clear. So that I would see this increase between federal and provincial coordination super important, because this the position we're in that is very fragmented, that weakens Canada's ability to negotiate from a position of strength globally. And I would say one of the solutions is to establish a federal provincial task force on trade resilience. So we can ensure that the national aligned economic strategies reduce provincial competition and inefficiencies. And I think there is a lot we can do here again. And this is coming from our own Canadian device, this lack of coordination, and I would say playing against your national team. The fifth option here to increase the internal trade within Canada is to enable a data-driven approach to trade policy. So despite the economic importance, there is actually very limited real-time data on interprovincial trade flows and regulatory impact. So this lack of transparency makes it very difficult to implement evidence-based reform. Obviously, if you don't have the data, it's difficult to come with new regulations, new options, and to get the buy-in from other elected officials and from the citizens. So this opportunity to create really a national trade data hub that will track internal trade trends, the barriers, the economic performance, that would be extremely helpful. And we do that already for international trade. So we could do that for internal trade and really understanding where are the biggest impact, what is the 80-20 to start with first. So these are 5 ideas or 5 options in order to improve Canada's internal trade situation. And as you can see, whether you're Canadian, whether you're American, whether you're listening or watching to this podcast from wherever in the world, there is a lot that can be done, and that is literally in our hands. So we don't have to look at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the US, and I would argue that these problems should have already been solved. But, again, that is probably the upside of the Trump administration, is that it's going to force us to look at things that we didn't want to look at because it's too airy. And the fact that we're really having to deal with that very strong and sudden exogenous shock might help getting everyone around the table ready to work together, which maybe we didn't have the impetus in the past, which is still very sad. So if we look at the future of trade, again, we have a great option, 5 options I just mentioned, but we have the possibility, it's not a pipe dream, to have a stronger, more resilient Canada. And really, by eliminating or at least drastically reducing internal trade inefficiency, Canada can increase productivity, which is something we've been suffering a lot in Canada, very, very below par productivity. We can increase our GDP growth. I was mentioning 4% earlier. We can strengthen economic resilience amid this US and global protectionism trend. We can enhance competitiveness in North America and global markets. So, I mean, the research is very clear, like a Canada without internal trade barriers is a more prosperous, is a more resilient, is a more competitive nation. So the question, obviously, as always, is will policymakers act? So I'll be super curious to hear or read what you think. What are the internal trade barriers that you see as the biggest obstacles as for Canada's economic success? Please reach out. Always happy to have a conversation. I really hope this podcast made you think and also see the opportunities. I'm a strong believer that any dislocation, any pressure is bringing opportunities to us. Right now, we have a lot of pressure coming from the US that is impacting the world. And I think for us living in Canada, Canadian, there are a lot of opportunities actually to build a stronger economy. Thanks, I know that might be weird to say that, but thanks to this external pressure coming from our neighbor. So thank you so much for listening, for watching, and I'm looking forward to our next episode together. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.